What happens if you try to create a ghost on purpose? In the early 1970s, a group of 8 people in Canada decided to find out. Not by investigating an old haunted house, not by summoning some ancient spirit, but by doing something much stranger. They tried to invent a ghost from scratch. They gave him a name, a face, a personality, a tragic backstory. They called him Philip, and Philip had never existed. He wasn't based on a real dead man. He wasn't supposed to be a spirit. He was completely fictional. And yet, after weeks of the group trying to contact him, something started answering back. The table moved. Knocks responded to questions, and the room began to feel like it wasn't empty anymore. This is the story of the Philip experiment, one of the most debated paranormal tests ever recorded. Because if the people involved were telling the truth, then they may have done something deeply unsettling. They may have created a haunting out of nothing. Let's dig a little deeper on Adjunct Horror. If you like horror, folklore, and those little unexplainable moments in history, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're talking about one of the most unusual paranormal experiments of the 20th century, and whether what happened in that room proved that spirits exist or proved that the human mind is way weirder than the supernatural world. To understand why this experiment happened at all, you first have to understand the moment it came out of. The early 1970s were full of renewed interest in the paranormal. Ghosts, ESP, seances, psychical research, all of it was having a cultural comeback. And in Toronto, a small group connected to the Toronto Society for Psychical Research wanted to test a very specific idea. Not whether ghosts were real exactly, but whether human expectation could create the appearance of a ghost. In other words, if a group of people concentrated hard enough on a fictional character, could they somehow generate paranormal activity? Could belief, or even just focused imagination, produce something that felt supernatural? It might sound ridiculous, and honestly, the people involved seemed to have known it, but they decided to try it anyway. And that's where Philip came in. Philip Azelford was carefully designed to feel like a real historical person. The group in Toronto gave him a whole life story. According to the version they created, Philip was an English aristocrat who lived in the 1600s. He was said to be unhappily married to a cold, distant noblewoman. Then, he fell in love with a young Romani woman named Margot. Philip's wife discovered the affair, and in a rage she accused Margot of witchcraft. And soon after, Margot was executed as a witch. Philip, overcome with guilt and grief, eventually took his own life. It's dramatic, a little gothic, kind of sounds like something halfway between a historical tragedy and a ghost story you'd tell by candlelight. And that was exactly the point. They weren't just inventing facts about Philip, they were building emotional weight, a personality, a presence. Someone they could all picture clearly, someone who felt psychologically real, even if he had never existed at all. At first, the group approached the experiment almost like a meditation exercise. They sat together, talked about Philip, visualized him, tried to imagine him as vividly as possible. And for a while, nothing happened. No sounds, no movement, no ghost. Which, honestly, would have been the end of the story if this were a normal experiment. But then, the group changed the atmosphere in the room. And that's when things started getting weird. Up to this point, nothing had happened. The group would meet, sit quietly, focus on Philip, and the room stayed completely still. No sign of anything at all. But one day, instead of sitting in silence, the group started treating their meeting more like a traditional seance. They dimmed the lights, sat around a table, held hands. But most importantly, they stopped being so serious. They talked to each other. They joked. They created this kind of loose, playful atmosphere. And for whatever reason, that's when things started to happen. At first, it was subtle. A faint sound, a small, sharp knock on the table. Easy to dismiss, easy to ignore. But it happened again and again. So the group tried something simple. They asked a question and told Philip to respond with a knock. 1 knock for yes, 2 knocks for no. At this point, it still felt like a game, something they half expected not to work. But finally, Philip answered. The group asked basic questions at first, simple things most anyone would know the answer to, and the knocks lined up consistently, correctly, over and over again, so they pushed things a little further. They asked about Philip's life, about the story they had created, about details only the group had agreed upon. And the responses still matched. Not randomly, not vaguely, but in a way that felt deliberate, as if something in the room understood exactly what the group was asking. Then, the movement started. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a slight shift, a subtle vibration from the table, the kind of thing you could still explain away by saying their hands were pressing too hard on the table or people bumped against it without realizing. But the movement didn't stop, and the table began to tilt, to lift up slightly on one end. At times, it even started to glide, not violently, not like something out of a movie, but in a controlled, responsive way that could not be ignored. And what's important to remember here is that this group was not made up of people who thought they were summoning a real ghost. That wasn't the goal. They knew Philip wasn't real. They had invented him, which made what was happening even harder to explain, because whatever was responding was answering questions correctly based on a fake backstory that only the people at the table knew. As the sessions continued, the atmosphere in the room started to change even more. The group described a feeling like there was something there with them, not visible, not clearly defined, but present. They would ask questions and wait, and in that silence, before the knock on the table came, there was this sense of anticipation, like something was deciding how to respond. But when it did respond, it felt immediate, intentional, almost aware. At that point, the experiment had clearly gone beyond what anyone expected. They weren't just imagining Philip anymore. They were interacting with something that could answer their questions, something that could move objects, something that behaved as if it had a mind of its own. So this one question became unavoidable. If Philip wasn't real, what exactly were they talking to? The most common explanation for what happened during the Philip experiment is something known as the ideomotor effect, which sounds pretty technical, but at its core is actually pretty simple. Basically, people can move things subconsciously without realizing they're doing it. Tiny muscle movements, small shifts in pressure, subtle motions that feel involuntary even when they're coming from your own body. It's the same explanation that's often used for things like Ouija boards, dowsing rods, and other forms of automatic or spirit-guided movement. And honestly, that explanation makes a lot of sense here. A group of people sitting together, all focused on the same invented figure, all people who were expecting and hoping something would happen, could absolutely create movement without any one of them intending to fake it. The knocks, the tilting table, the sense that something was responding. All of that could emerge from shared suggestion, unconscious motion, and group psychology. But even if that's true, the Philip experiment is still deeply unsettling, because if a room full of people can create something that feels real, something that answers back, something that alters the emotional state of a space, then the difference between imagined and experienced starts to get really blurry really fast. Philip may not have been a ghost in the traditional sense, but whatever happened in that room felt real enough to leave an impression. And maybe that's the part of the experiment that sticks with people. Not the idea that they contacted a dead man, but the possibility that the human mind, especially in groups, especially under the right conditions, can create something that behaves like a presence. Not because it's supernatural necessarily, but because belief, expectation, emotion, and ritual are powerful enough to fill some kind of absence that exists in all of us. And that in itself is a kind of haunting. Because if Philip wasn't real, and something still answered, then maybe the question isn't, did they summon a ghost? Maybe the question is, what exactly did they create instead? A shared hallucination? A psychological echo? A kind of momentary thought form built out of attention and repetition? There are a lot of people who would say yes, that what the group created wasn't a spirit of the dead, but was something like an idea that has energy and momentum, a presence assembled piece by piece until it started behaving as if it belonged in the room. And whether you believe it or not, it's not hard to understand why the story has lasted. Because in addition to the scientific and possible paranormal aspects, for a lot of people, the Philip experiment gets to a very old human desire, something that's been the subject of tragedies, paranormal pursuits, and horror stories for centuries. It's that desire to bring someone we've lost back. After all, if this group in Toronto possibly summoned an entity who never existed, maybe, just maybe, we really can contact the people in our lives who are gone. Of course, as those countless horror stories have taught us, and as the group involved in the Philip experiment came to realize, you can reach out, but you never really know who's responding. If you like horror, folklore, and those unexplainable moments in history, make sure to subscribe, because there are a lot more stories, and many of them are even harder to explain than this one. Thanks for watching. Bye, y'all.